This is David Wiggins from George Mason University. I'm a member of the American Academy of Kinesiology and Physical Education with the number of 483. And I'm speaking today with Dr. Roberta Park from the University of California, Berkeley, who is also a member of the American Academy of Kinesiology and Physical Education with the number 261. Professor Park is a well-known historian of sport and physical education who has published a plethora of scholarly articles in the top academic journals in her field and co-edited, among other works, Play, Games, and Sports in Cultural Context and Sport and Exercise Science, Essays in the History of Sports Medicine. Roberta, thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome, David.
Let's start out by, I'd like to ask you really about the early leaders in physical education and kinesiology. And specifically, I'd like to ask you, what leaders in physical education and kinesiology most affected you and your career? Any specific stories or anecdotes that you might have about this person or these individuals?
Well, sure. That, of course, wouldn't be the earliest people in physical education, but people, I came to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate student in French in 1949, and came by chance after about a year here to the gymnasium, and ultimately came upon Professor Anna Espenshade, who was the vice chair of the department at that time. And I, was majoring in French, and I only came over to the gym because I like sports and things like that. And after about 2.5 years at Berkeley, I said to myself one day, well, gee, I don't think I want to spend my whole life indoors and things like that. And ultimately, I did teach French for 6 months in the public schools, and I was very glad that at the end of my junior year, I changed my major to physical education. But it was Espenshade, really, who was instrumental in me becoming a physical education major, because when I went to see her, I talked with her about, well, maybe I could also major in physical education, and she said a few nice words, and then she said, well, what year are you? And I said, well, I'm finishing my junior year, and she said, well, I don't think so, Then she asked me what prerequisite I had taken, just as my university breadth requirements that all students have to take. And by chance, I had taken physiology and anatomy and psychology and some of the other courses that are prerequisite to physical education major. So she did a little calculation. And she said, well, if you go to both summer sessions and you do all physical education next year and then you go to summer session again, you could graduate pretty close with your class and things like that. So I did it. And I have her to thank for a lot of things. And I also took Franklin Henry's exercise physiology class, and I did surprisingly well in his exercise physiology class, which I liked quite a bit. He was not a good lecturer, but he sure was great in the laboratories. And PE majors, as I'm sure you know, have to take a lot of laboratory classes.
Yes, yes.
So it was those two people who were most influential.
Any particular stories about Franklin Henry? I know all of us that know a bit about the history of physical education hear stories occasionally about Franklin Henry. Anything specific that you could talk about, Roberta?
Sure. Yeah, I got to know Franklin very well because, pardon me, I was invited to come back and become a member of the faculty here at UC Berkeley in 1959. I had been away for a while. I got my degree, and then I went and did my master's degree at Ohio State University, and I came back and I was teaching in the Oakland Public Schools. And I had quite a number of student teachers, young women who were doing their student teaching, and Oakland Tech was close to the university, so that's a place where a lot of them went. And I was, young and very active and liked teaching and things like that, so somehow or other the ladies at UC Berkeley had heard about, that there was this good teacher at Oakland Tech. And I got this invitation, and I almost turned it down. My mother said, nah, you ought to think about that. So I came to Berkeley, and then I was a faculty member. So I got to know Franklin in a different kind of way, and I knew him until he retired. And then after he retired, because he had to retire at age 67, I think it was back then.
Yes.
And after he retired, I was serving in a capacity which was not like it was sort of like the vice chair, but it was the person who was in charge of the professional side of the program for women. And I got to know him pretty well, and after he retired, I'd go and visit him in his office, which was down in Harmon Gymnasium. And he loved to have people come down and see him, and he talked to me for an hour and a half, and shared a lot of interesting stories with me. But I'll tell you a few things about Franklin that some people know, but maybe not all. He was really a very kind man. He didn't always seem that way to his students because he was very demanding. If they didn't present their lectures well or they didn't do things well, he really let them have it.
Right.
But he was really a very kind man, and he cared about those kids a lot. And he'd go down into his office, which was the biggest mess you'd ever want to see in your entire life. Although I'm emulating Franklin. As I'm looking around in my office right now, I sort of took lessons from him. My office is stacked with books and articles and printouts and all this stuff. I've been working on too many papers lately. And, he shared a lot of interesting stories with me about his childhood and how he came ultimately to the field of physical education, which most people do not know. He had no training in physical education whatsoever, not one bit.
I didn't realize that.
No, he joined the Navy when he was 16, and he had spoofed about his age because you have to be 17 to join the Navy. He joined the Navy, and he learned to be a radio man in the Navy. And he really quite liked that, and he was very good at technical things, exceedingly good. So when he finished his naval career, which I think about 6 or 7 years, something like that, maybe only 4, he then started to work for a radio station back in, I think it was Missouri, one of the Midwestern states, and then he heard about some work that was being done. I forget the name of it. I wrote an article about Franklin, which is published in the Research Quarterly 10 years ago, and it's all in that article. And so we went down to Arizona to learn some other kinds of technical skills and things like that, and then he got married, and he and his wife moved up to the Bay Area. And he was looking for work. This was a Depression time. And the people over in the Department of Psychology needed someone to construct research equipment because you couldn't buy a lot of that stuff back then. You had to have it made.
Right.
So he started working for them, and then he enrolled in the doctoral program. And you could enroll in the doctoral program if you didn't have an undergraduate degree back then, believe it or not.
Well, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, you could. He had almost a bachelor's degree. I don't think he finished it. He might have, but he had it from a small Midwestern college. So he enrolled in the doctoral degree, and he was interested in physiological psychology, which was why his real field was motor learning. That was his major field, although he's known to people to an extensive degree as an exercise physiologist.
Right.
And the reason he became an exercise physiologist was the Department of Physical Education was looking for someone to teach the exercise physiology class because Frank Kleberger, who was the chair at the time, there were separate departments for men and for women. But the upper division academic courses were cross-listed. Women as well as men could take exercise physiology, which was taught by Kleberger, and men as well as women could take the history class, which was taught by one of the women, etc. And so Kleberger was looking for somebody to teach the exercise physiology class, and he hired Henry. And Henry was, he was a good scientist, and so he taught that class. And here's something else most people don't know. They don't even know this person's name. This person's name was Pauline Hodgson. She was a member of the Department of Physical Education for Women. Hodgson had received her bachelor's degree in physical education from UC Berkeley. She had received her Master of Science degree from University of Michigan in physiological chemistry, which is the old name for biochemistry.
Right.
And she'd received her PhD in physiology from UC Berkeley. So when Kleberger retired, it was Hodgson's hope that she, of course, would become the exercise physiology professor. And she'd been doing some research. Espenshade had been helping her on certain physiological conditions of women playing basketball. and had published this in the Research Quarterly, a couple of articles. And she was devastated when Kleberger decided that, no, we don't have women do that, because there were, the only person I can think of who was doing exercise physiology at the time was, oh God, I can't think of her name. Alison Wren wrote about this woman in her PhD dissertation. It'll come back to me. But there was some woman who was not in physical education who was doing exercise physiology, and I can't think of any other woman who was doing this. So, anyway, Henry became the exercise physiology person, and he also taught the motor learning. But he had many, many, many more students in exercise physiology than he ever did in motor learning. But an interesting guy, and a good man.
That's very good. Roberta, major turning points in the field of kinesiology and physical education that you can think of, changes that were for the good, changes that were not as good. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the major turning points in kinesiology and physical education?
Sure. When the field started, as I know you know, with the formation of the Association for the Advancement of Physical Education in 1885, lots of the people who were instrumental in developing that and who then also were very active with it for about 20 years were medical doctors. In fact, medical doctors held a lot of the original presidencies. In fact, there was only 9 of the first 10 presidents of the AAPE were medical doctors.
Right.
And the reason that medical doctors were particularly interested in physical education, there were several, but the two major reasons were, A, this was a period during which there was a considerable amount of interest broadly within the United States and other countries in health, hygiene, public health, and those kinds of things. American Public Health Association having been formed in 1872 and so forth. There were precursors to it, but the association itself formed in 1872.
Right.
And there were more kids who were going to school, and people didn't know a lot about how communicable diseases were, brought about and all of that sort of stuff. So there was that kind of interest. The other reason was that there were way too many doctors in the United States. Medicine was not a well-developed, scientifically based field any place except maybe in Germany, a little bit in France. In fact, I think I've said this to you before, those American physicians starting in the 1860s and 1870s who wanted the best medical education, they went abroad initially to France, but by the 1870s they were going to Germany and German-speaking countries where science-based medicine was rapidly developing. And that kind of science-based medicine did not occur in the United States until after the Flexner Report of 1910. Abraham Flexner had been called upon to do a sort of survey review of American medical education, and he was pretty critical of it. And I think it was the Carnegie Foundation that had asked for this. It was one of those organizations. And so after the Flexner Report came out, there were motivations to improve medical education. Then the First World War came along, and that sort of stopped things for a while. But starting in the 1920s, medical education in the United States changed quite rapidly. And there's a rapid decline in the number of individuals, men, and a few women as well, who were medical doctors who had much of anything to do with physical education. There were some very important ones, people like Thomas Denison Wood, for example, and the guy who was the chair of the first state to have physical education required. I know his name, and it's escaped me at the moment, but he was a medical doctor as well. His name will come back to me in a minute.
Okay.
But the field struggled along quite a bit its first 20 years, and actually the field to back up, there was more research by far that was being done in things related to the psychosocial side of physical education, and that was all spurred by, Stanley Clark. And G. Stanley Hall, who was president at Clark University.
Right.
And Hall had a lot of students who, he wanted graduate students and he wanted to advance himself and his status. But also they were doing some very good things, and a lot of the research that they were doing in the 1890s and early 1900s is not very different than the research that some people are doing today, that's for sure. And so that, some physical educators were interested in that, but they were sort of stuck on the systematized gymnastics, either the Germans type or the Swedish type, or one of the others. Particularly that, sorry, I don't have a cold, but when I talk a lot, I just have to say.
That's fine.
And the reason I think, and I've thought about this a lot and read a lot of things, that they were stuck on the systematized gymnastics was because you could measure things. They took anthropometric measurements to the wazoo.
Right.
And that seemed to have a patina of science, and, you could make comparisons and things of that general nature. They thought it was more systematic. And as you know, it wasn't until the 1920s when games and sports really became a part of physical education. Sure, there were precursors to it, some as early as the early 1900s, but it wasn't until the 1920s. And also the Playground Association of America, as you know, was formed in 1906, and Luther Halsey Gulick, who was a very influential person in physical education, in the YMCA, in the in a child study movement, and all those kinds of things. Gulick did an enormous number of things, a lot of great things.
Right.
He was the first president of the Playground Association of America. And those things sort of began to come together more in physical education in the 1920s. So I think the 1920s were a very important period for physical education.
Yes.
There was a little more research that people in physical education began to do. They became a little bit more involved, not very much, mostly professional and applied things. But that began to grow. This was a period when laws requiring physical education in the different states began to be implemented. That was very important for physical education. Most people don't know that it wasn't until 1916 that the first law was implemented in the state of New York, and that almost all states had laws by the 1940s.
Right.
And those laws exist today, David, and like in California, we have a law that the schools must teach physical education, but it's ignored.
Right, I know that.
It's amazing. It's
Absolutely.
amazing. As all of these debates go on about healthcare and all of that, nobody focuses on prevention.
Right.
And the kids sit around in the schools and they get, overweight and all of this sort of stuff. So, the 20s, I think, were important. The formation of the Research Quarterly in 1930, that was important. It helped to stimulate more research, more graduate students, all those kinds of things. And then physical education really took off after World War II. And by 1960, when, oh, golly, what was the name of the book? There was a book to which, it's on my shelves here someplace. I got to think of the name of it because it's terribly, terribly important. 1960.
Not Warren Johnson.
Yeah, Warren Johnson was the editor.
Yes.
And I can't think of the name of it. I'm not sure I have one in front of me here. But the title was, hold on just a minute. Yeah, the title was Science and Medicine of Exercise and Sports.
Right.
That was an enormously important book. And there were quite a number of people in the field of physical education who contributed to that. There were, they were physiologists and there were psychologists and a lot of other people.
Right.
But it was also in 1960 that the Research Quarterly published a special edition about the contributions of exercise physiology to physiological development, to psychological development, things like that, and that was an important milestone as well.
Right.
The American College of Sports Medicine had grown slightly by then, founded in 1954, only 6 years old, but it was beginning to grow. And those things were really important. And then, as you know, there was that article by Franklin in 1964, Physical Education and Academic Discipline, which in some ways was like a stick of dynamite in the field.
Right.
Now, I need to tell you a few things, and I think I've said this before, but they're really important. I need to tell you a few things about that paper. That paper was motivated by the fact that in the state of California, the state legislature, a member of the state legislature, a senator, had passed a bill, I think it was Senate Bill 57, as I recall, and that bill specified that in order to be a principal of a high school or a counselor or anything like that in a high school, you have to have an academic major.
Okay.
Now, many people blame the Conant report for belittling physical education. I don't think the Conant report so much belittled physical education, because if you read it carefully, Conant is saying that physical education is one of those fields that is an applied field.
Right.
And that this is important, and therefore that's what should be emphasized. That his words could be interpreted to mean that the scientific and academic side wasn't important. Could be interpreted that way, but it could be interpreted differently as well. So Conant gets a lot of blame for this. But it was this Senate bill in California that blew the top off. Franklin, Henry, Anna Espenshade, Pauline Hodgson, and the guy who was the chair of the department at the time, I can't remember his name offhand. I knew him very well. Quite a nice guy. Why, they said, well, we can't have this because our students are not going to want to major in physical education, because a lot of people who did physical education, particularly the males, they went off and they taught physical education. Some of them became coaches, and
right.
a lot of them moved on and were principals of high schools. Well, you know, if a city board has got to choose between some gentleman who, you know, is kind of quiet and shy and bashful and all of that,
right,
and some guy who is personable and people like and all of that, the football coach and stuff like that, why, they're going to choose the guy who is personable,
sure,
being the principal.
Absolutely.
And, you know, a lot of football coaches, certainly Cal graduates, were very smart men. They were very smart men. They just happened to like coaching.
Right, right.
And it is said, I have no direct proof for this, but it is said that the man who put forth this bill, the Fisher bill, was what it was called, had been annoyed because he had been bypassed for one of these leadership positions. I don't know if that's true or not. Anyway, Franklin and Anna and Pauline and Carl Nordley, Carl Nordley was our chair at the time. They got together, and I was here at Berkeley at the time, but I didn't know anything about it because I was just a sort of beginner. I'd been here 5 years. And they, all four of them, drafted that basic statement upon which physical education as an academic major is based.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Wow.
They chose Franklin to go before the state legislature or Board of Education, or maybe both of them, and deliver the message, which Franklin did, and he was quite successful. And it was then decided within a very short time that at UC Berkeley, the physical education major was academic, only place in the state of California. UC Davis would then follow, and then after that some other institutions would follow as well. But what people don't realize is that those four people, Franklin, Anna, Carl, and Pauline, described the AB major at UC Berkeley exactly as it was. People say, oh, there's a great idea, you know, he revolutionized it because he came up with a whole new idea. No. That was the undergraduate major at UC Berkeley at the time.
Interesting.
Yep. And so, you know, that was a really very important period. And then from the 1964, when that was published in the Jover and delivered 6 months earlier at the Men's Physical Education Society, that sort of really began to push people forward to become more involved in research. The background for all of that, as I'm sure you know, that Sputnik had been launched about 8 years or 7 years earlier.
Right. And
colleges and universities were putting more emphasis on research anyway, so it fit in pretty well with that. And then we find a number of institutions growing, and you look at the research quarterly, you see the quality of research beginning to grow and things of that general nature. So by the early 1970s, there are enough people in physical education and people who are interested in that kind of research that people in physical education were doing, that they established things like the International Journal of Biomechanics, the Journal of Sport History, the Journal of Sports Psychology, and on, all these specialized journals.
Yes.
They begin to grow. And so there was this specialization that was occurring, but in the beginning, that didn't seem to be hurting the field very much, because the AHPERD annual meetings still gave quite a bit of attention to research. They had good sessions, and so people would go to AFER meetings as well as I would go to AFER meetings, and I would go to North American Society for Sport History. And sometimes I would go to ACSM meetings as well. There were people, exercise physiologists, who would go to AFER and they'd go to ACSM. Then, as I'm sure you know, in the second half of the 1970s, maybe it started earlier, AFER began to make a number of changes. They decided that they would become an alliance instead of an association.
Right.
And Bruce Bennett warned them. He warned them at the time. And some of us were quite disturbed about that, because if you look in the dictionary, an association is different from an alliance.
Absolutely.
And they also moved to Reston, Virginia, out of Washington, D.C., which was really too bad. I guess they wanted to sever from National Education Association. I wasn't against that, but still. They built this big building in Reston. They went into financial difficulties. You've seen the Research Quarterly from about 1974 to about 1982 or something like that, 80. It's printed on paper that's like newspaper paper.
Right, absolutely.
And, they made all these really, really stupid decisions at the national level. Presidents who were elected annually, you could say they had some part of it, but that was mostly coming out of the paid leadership, who was there year to year to year, and the field just began to come apart. And so that contributed, of course, and the quality of the research sessions at AFER began to decline, because people began to say, well, we're not getting support, and look at how they're publishing our stuff. We're not going to submit any more to the Research Quarterly.
Right.
And so by the late 70s and early 1980s, you get into this period which you know very well, where there are these continual meetings, both of different organizations, but meetings that are called, and asking chairs of departments of physical education from around the United States to come to these meetings to discuss where we're going to go as a field. Now, I became the chair of the Department of Physical Education at UC Berkeley in 1982, a job I never wanted. Promised 3 years, did 10. But since I was the chair, I would go to all these meetings. And I know I said this to you before. It was just amazing at these meetings. People who knew each other and they liked each other, and they would begin to talk with each other about, the field and this and that and the other. And before long, the discussions would turn into, physiology is more important than philosophy, and this is more important than that. And then it would begin to turn into something that, if you translated it, would sort of be like, well, me an exercise physiologist and you're only a historian. You can't do that. If you fight... I learned in the neighborhood where I was born and raised, blue-class neighborhood, if you want to fight, you better fight within your own house, because you fight in the street, you have weakened yourself in the neighborhood.
Absolutely.
And there were all these public fights that were going on, and the field began to turn down and down and down and down, and we have not recovered.
I agree.
We have not recovered, and it is astonishing, just absolutely astonishing. In addition to what I prattled on about so much when we last talked, I came across about a month ago, because I had gotten the publication a short while earlier. It was the April 2009 issue of the President's Council on Physical and Fitness and Sports Research Digest. And there's an article in there by Maureen Weiss,
yes.
who's now at University of
Minnesota,
I guess,
yes.
and someone else. And about three-quarters of the way through the article, a section begins with, I paraphrase, but basically these words: we have all this evidence, and we must put this evidence into practice. Now, what can be more important than that?
No, nothing.
And I used to say to my colleagues during the 1980s and during the 1990s and again and again and again, look, you've got to think about physical education as being, a field like medicine.
Right.
Medicine has a strong academic research core.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have a big applied dimension,
right,
then you don't have medicine.
Absolutely.
And Liz Bressan, who wrote The Profession is Dead, years 2000, The Profession is Dead, was it murder or suicide? She wrote that in
Quest, I believe.
The late 1970s or early 1980s. She was absolutely right.
Yes.
And it wasn't murder, it was suicide.
Mm-hmm.
It was absolute suicide. And even though last week the new Surgeon General of the United States, I got an email that was, I forget where the email came from, but it was an attachment of the new Surgeon General's remarks about public health in 2010. And there's one section in there where this lady, who is the new Surgeon General, is saying, we have to have better physical education. Now, we got to stop saying these things, and we got to do it.
Right.
But people in the field of physical education have got to pick up the banner, and they have got to be the leading proponents for this. And I do not hear them saying this. I do not hear AFER saying this. I won't say which state universities. There is no branch of the University of California that anymore has a degree program in physical education.
Right.
There is no major university in the state of California. Not Stanford, not Pomona, none of them. A couple of small ones. And, of course, the state university system does not give PhDs. They go to the master's degree. But within the state university system, I've talked with some of my friends in 3 or 4 other state universities, and they're not emphasizing the pedagogy side either.
Right.
What are we doing to ourselves? I do not understand it, Dave.
I agree.
It's appalling.
Tell me, Roberta, that brings up another question I have for you. What role do you believe that the American Academy of Kinesiology and Physical Education can play? Is there something that this specific group can do to make things better?
Well, yeah, I don't know how powerful the Academy is because most people don't know what it is. So it's got to make its presence better known with important groups, and it's got a lot of intelligent people who, can certainly speak the proper way. You can. The presentation that D. Eddington gave, at the last Academy meeting where he brought up a number of important points, things like that.
Right.
As you well know, ACSM started a couple of years ago, Exercise is Medicine, and they've been talking with the U.S. Congress, and they've been working with various other groups to try to foster this. But ACSM has never been known for doing things in relation to the public schools. Now, I'm not saying the public schools are the only important thing, but the public schools touch the lives of more young people than any institution in the country.
Yes.
Any at all. And if we don't return quality physical education to the public schools and return quality community recreation programs to communities so that playgrounds are places for kids to developing good physiological health, but also moral and social health, and stop being places where drugs are dealt. I mean, that's what playgrounds in the state in the city of Oakland. It's where drugs are dealt. I drive by playgrounds any time of day. There are no programs for kids anymore in those. It's appalling to me. So, if if the Academy were to partner with ACSM and a couple of other groups. I would like for them to partner with the HPERD, but HPER doesn't know what it's doing.
Right.
Somebody's got to take a hold of HPERD and turn it around. It really has got to. And I don't know if you got the inquiry about 2 months ago or something like that, commenting about, well, what do you think about these changes? What do you think about the name change and all of that?
Yeah.
I took advantage of that, and I really went on at great length about some of the things we're talking about. You know, it's imperative that AFER really do something to become the spokesperson for the field again, and if it doesn't, I don't know.
Right.
The American Kinesiology Association, which is not the Academy, but the American Kinesiology Association, started by
Cheryl Hoffman.
And come on, Robbie.
Was Jerry Thomas involved?
Yeah, Jerry Thomas. You know, that's a great idea, but if we have too many organizations, that doesn't work either.
Right.
We've got to seize the opportunity now. Now, I don't know whether ACSM would work with the Academy on this, but some kind of organization has got to become the spokesperson for what really needs to be done. And I would hope it would be the Academy, because I don't see any other group that can do this.
Right.
I really don't.
Right.
And all the evidence is there.
Absolutely.
I got an email from ACSM this morning, and it has an attachment, as they always do, and I went down and I read several of them. And one of the first ones says something about doctors agree that exercise is important, but less than 39% or 39% or something like that advise their patients about exercise. Well, you know, come on, folks. Come on, folks. It isn't rocket science.
Roberta, I'm interested in, as families, significant others, and friends ultimately are so important in terms of, well, in a variety of different ways. And I'm just curious about the support that you received from your mother and father. Were they athletes? Were they people interested in physical education? And maybe last, but in some ways most interesting to me, is were they supportive of you making the switch into physical education?
David, I could not have asked for a better family. In this world, I could not have asked for a better family. Both of my parents were very bright. My dad, who was born in 1900, like most young fellows back then, he went to the 9th grade, and then he went out and got a job. He was a mechanic. He could make anything work, from automobiles to the equipment that puts asphalt down on highways. He'd make anything work. My mom had gone to the 10th grade. She would have graduated from high school. Her mother contracted double pneumonia and pleurisy. My mom had to leave high school to take care of her. I learned more from my mother about the parts of speech and all of those things that one is taught in an English class than I ever learned from my high school teachers. It was thanks to my mother, not my high school teachers, that I passed the Subject A examination, which was very important to get into UC Berkeley. I had no idea it was taken, and I'll tell you about that later if you want to know. But I also had really great grandparents. My father was the youngest of 10 children, so his father had died by the time I was born. I didn't know him, but I knew my father's mother.
Right.
And my mother's parents, who had arrived in this country in 1889, my grandfather was a spectacularly great cabinet maker. He made the most gorgeous, gorgeous furniture. And there was not much call for that, so we went into the building trades when he arrived here and built houses and small stores and churches and stuff like that. And he taught me all kinds of mechanical arts in his carpentry shop, and I learned more about geometry in my grandfather's carpentry shop than I learned in my high school geometry class. This is true. I was expected to work hard as a child. I had tasks from the time I was a small child, like I had to collect the eggs. You could have chickens inside cities at that time. I had to collect the eggs, and I had to, dig things to plant. We grew all of our own food and stuff like that. I had to learn to iron, and I still iron everything except towels. Everything. My friends look at me and say, "What's the matter with you?" I put on unironed underwear. I can't bear it. you know, they were very kind to me, but I was expected to live up to certain kind of standards, and when I didn't, I got into trouble. And I can remember living in a neighborhood. There were lots of kids from the Azores Island. They were great kids and stuff. My parents were from the Azores Island. But, you know, four-letter words were part of the vernacular. And when I spewed out a few four-letter words, one day my mother took me in the bathroom, shoved a bar of Lifebuoy soap in my mouth, and said, "Don't you ever do that again." Now, Dave, I had a spectacularly wonderful family. They wanted me to go to college. I did not want to go to college because I had a job. And I was making $1.25 an hour. That was big money.
You were rich.
Oh, I was making big money. And none of the kids in my neighborhood were going to college. And I know I told you this before, but it was by chance that I had taken the Subject A exam. I was in this 12th grade English class, and the teacher had said, you know, you're all going to go down to the auditorium in Oakland 2 weeks and take this test. I don't know what she's talking about. And the first part was easy because of what my mother had taught me about parts of speech. The second part was, you know, or the third part, whatever, it says write an essay, and I knew what an essay meant, and then it gave you 4 or 5 topics. I didn't know what the first 3 were,
Right.
And then, like I told you, the fourth one was write an essay about the history of the California missions. That was easy for me because it was the in thing to carve missions out of bars of Lifebuoy soap. And because I liked mechanical arts, I had done that. Girls did it, but mostly boys did it. And so I'd have to read, and I'd carve San Juan Capistrano and Mission Carmel and whatever. So
and Junipero Serra.
Yeah, you know, and I wrote all these, you know, sure, I'll write this. So when Mrs. Hughes comes about 2 or 3 weeks later, and she's got these little gray envelopes, and she's walking up and down the aisles, and she's saying, "Oh, Charlotte, I'm so sorry," and you know, "James, I'm so sorry." And then she gets to Roger, who was teacher's pet. "Oh, Roger, I'm so sorry." And Roger's going, "Oh." And then she puts mine down on my desk, and I'm looking around. I don't know what's going on. I open this envelope, and there's great big red pass stamped in the middle of it. And when my mother found out about that, she said, "No way." She says, "You're going to go to college." And my dad, he didn't talk very much. If he said 200 words a day, he talked a lot. He said, "No, you better go to college." So I did, and it was, you know, it changed my life.
Wow, absolutely.
I couldn't have asked for a better family. And that's another thing, you know, if I had the power to sue for libel television programs for not so much, well, libel, yeah, but licentious things,
yes,
and violent things, I would sue these television stations to kazoo. How dare they put this in front of people? How dare they put it in front of children? And children can watch it. You know, it's no wonder the kids are the way they are.
Sure.
I do not know what's the matter with our society.
I don't understand. Were you an only child, Roberta?
Yeah, I was. I was a depression baby, and I think my parents would have had more kids, but they were kind of concerned because my dad, who was a hard worker, who was out of work all the time, and you know, he did anything. I mean, he really did shovel work, you know, just anything to have a job. So I think they would have had more kids, but I'm concerned about that.
Do you lifelong friends? Do you have a number of lifelong friends?
Yeah, I still have some around. You know, they go bye-bye by the time they get to be my age. But yeah, I still have some around. In fact, I talk with one of them every evening, stuff like that.
And are you how about former colleagues? Are you still in contact with colleagues at UC Berkeley?
Yeah, again, a lot of them have unfortunately gone to heaven or the other place. I think most of them have gone to heaven because they're pretty nice people. But yeah, in fact, I had lunch with one of them. She and I came the same year. About last week we went to the faculty club with another friend. We had lunch there, and I see Ken Min with some frequency. Ken's a great guy. He martial arts expert and has spread martial arts around the world. We go out to lunch or dinner from time to time, and I'm in touch with Hal Fry, who was the gymnastics coach here, and other people.
Yes.
Yeah.
What? Just a couple other things. What are you currently working on right now, Roberta, in terms of your research and scholarship?
Oh, well, I just finished about a week ago from La Bomba to Baseball, Sport and the Americanization of Puerto Rico, 1898 to 1950. And I did that because, you know Tony Mangan.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, Tony had wanted a conference workshop. He's initiated several of these in different countries. He wanted one at Berkeley because he had taught here for a semester in 1985 when I was the chair, and he loved it here, and he wanted to come back. And so Mark Driessen and I organized it, and since it was here at Berkeley, Mark organized the speakers, and I did the rest of the organization, and I agreed to do a paper. And since I can read Spanish quite well, because my undergraduate major was Romance languages, French, and Spanish.
Right.
And so I decided to do that. First I wasn't going to do anything, and then Tony said, "Oh, no, you got to give a paper too." And I thought, "Oh, what am I going to do a paper on?" And so I decided, well, I'll do this one because I can read the Spanish.
Right.
And then I just started yesterday something that has to do with the way physical education was discussed at international conferences of education and things like that, beginning in the 1890s. I've done some research on the earlier period, and so I'm going to bring a little bit of that in, and I'm going to work mostly on the 1920s and 30s. And the reason I was motivated to do that was twofold. Some of the things we've been talking about, and how at these conferences, discussions of physical education intersected with discussions of health and hygiene and discussions of education more broadly.
Right.
So I'm going to work on that. And then I don't quite know what I'm going to do.
Well, listen, Roberta, is there anything else that you'd like to mention?
Well, you asked me a couple of questions last time, and I thought about that a lot after we had talked to you. You said, what did I think were some of the better things that I'd written?
Yes, yes.
I think a couple of the more recent papers, because they relate so much to what's going on now. Boys' clubs are better than policemen's clubs, endeavors to prevent juvenile crime. And this is from the late 1880s to the First World War.
Interesting.
And a couple of other papers that are sort of that. One of them I happen to have, I printed it out because I knew you were going to call me. The VITA, Bridging the Gap Between Knowledge and Practice, or When Americans Really Built Programs to Foster Healthy Lifestyles, 1918 to 1940. But one that I didn't mention, and I really should have, because hardly anybody knows about this. Why would they ever know about it? Because it's not where historians tend to look for things. Now, can I find it? Where is it? Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Well, there was a Sports and Recreation Among Chinese American Communities. That's a pretty good paper.
Yes.
From the time of arrival to the 1950s. I did that largely because I had a lot of Chinese American friends, which I know I mentioned to you before. But there was this other thing that was, and that thing in Quest, 1998, called A House Divided.
Yes.
Yeah, that one really, I think...
very good piece.
I was asked by Jack Wilmore to do that because I had said something to him about the house being divided, and then he said, "Oh, I'll write a paper about that." But this other thing was published in the, wait a minute, I've got a copy of the thing here someplace on my shelf. 1992, it was published in Exercise and Sports Science Reviews, which are no longer published. No. Instead, they come out with monthly things. This one, if I dare say so, I thought was fairly creative the way I figured out how to do it.
Yes.
Took me for a long time to do it. Oh, yeah. Human energy expenditure from Australopithecus afarensis to the 4-minute mile.
Wow.
Exemplars and case studies. And what I did, it's a long piece, and what I did was, this was sort of motivated by something that Steve Blair had spoken about at some conference. And then I had talked with him after the conference, and then he encouraged me to see what I could do. And so what I did was I went back and used a whole lot of different kinds of information, whatever I could find, to figure out what people ate. And there's a surprising amount of pretty good stuff that's been written, really, about what kind of foodstuffs were consumed at different times throughout history. I didn't know that till I started this paper.
That's interesting.
And then to sort of figure out what their working patterns were, and so what their energy expenditure would be. And what made me think about the fact that I might be able to do the latter, that is the energy expenditure, was because, as I told you, I've been to England 15, 16, 17 times. And one of the times when I was living in England, I lived there for 6 months, something like that, I would go around and, visit these historical sites. And there was one place up in the northwestern part, and it was a resurrected cotton mill. And they had resurrected, all of the machinery, and they had posted the number of hours that people worked and all that kind of stuff. And I began to think about, they did have that kind of information, how many hours they worked. And then when I was spending time in Wales, I'd gone to visit some of the coal mines there, and they had some historical recordings of the coal mines. And women worked in coal mines as well back then in Wales, not so much, not in maybe in the north of England, but not so much in the north of England, but in Wales they did. And so I kind of figured out, what kinds of, energy expenditure they were doing. Amazing stuff.
Interesting.
But the thing that really, I think, gave me the sort of best information was some work that was done by, I can't remember the guy's name. I don't want to spend much time here, but a chap who'd done a study on Caribbean slaves and their working hours. And I've been to the Caribbean several times, and I had gone to St. John, where they have resurrected a sugar mill, and they have the big heavy barrels in which they sort of reduce the sugar to make what was they make? Not rum. Oh, rum, yeah.
Yes.
And all those kinds of things. They had all that kind of stuff. And I came across this book that this fellow had written, and I can't think of the name of it offhand, but if you're interested, I can look it up and find it. But in there, he had given a lot of information because apparently the slaveholders had kept this information about the number of slaves that they had, the hours that they worked, and what jobs they worked at, and all those kinds of things.
Yes.
They had done on the French-speaking islands, like Martinique, but there were much better data for the English-speaking islands. And when you look at that stuff, it is frightening. These people worked during the season. They worked as much as 18 straight hours.
Yes.
How could they do it?
I don't know.
How could they do it?
Right.
I'm reading this. During crop season, first gang laborers also worked in sugar manufacturing plants at tasks such as feeding cane and presses, boiling sugar, stoking fires, moving hogsheads of liquid weighing up to a ton. They didn't do it by themselves, of course. These grueling labors, evidence for this at the Annenberg Sugar Mill on St. John Island, U.S. Virgin Islands. And when you calculate that stuff, it is absolutely appalling.
Yes, yes.
But, that I think was one of the more innovative things that I ever wrote. And then, of course, I did several papers, like I told you before, so I could practice my French. Those were the earlier ones.
Yes.
And then I can read German modestly well, not moderately, just modestly well. So I did a couple of papers that no one would ever know about because they were published in the Journal of the West, German Association with Sporting Life in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yes, yes.
That's a pretty good paper.
Yes.
If I do say so myself.
That was probably edited by Don Rozak. I didn't Don do those special issues, I think?
Could well be.
I think it was Don Rozak, yes. Those were actually very good. There's some very good pieces in those. Roberta, do you you've had a very good collection of graduate students, it seems to me. From Susan Zeev to Allison Wren and others. Do you still maintain pretty close contact with your graduate students?
Yes, I do. I had very few graduate students, Dave. The reason was that there weren't very many jobs in sport history, and so I said to people, who wanted to do it, I said, I really shouldn't take you as a graduate student because there are hardly any jobs out there.
Right.
Susan came as an exercise physiology graduate student, and all of our graduate students had to take a graduate seminar on the other side of the house. If they were doing the biological sciences, they had to take Brenda Bredemeyer's sports sociology or a psychology class or whatever, or we had a sociology class or sociology/anthropology. I taught it sometimes, and then the history. And my students either had to take motor learning or they had to take exercise physiology or whatever. And I initiated that requirement when I became the chair because I wanted our students to realize that this was a field that embraced both the biological and the social psychological sciences. They weren't going to become experts at this, but you know, that they they needed to know that, because if they went out and they were going to become colleagues in some department or they were going to become department chairs, they had to sort of think excuse me, about the field in this kind of way.
Yes, yes.
So Susan took the exercise the sport history class, and she decided to change her major. Allison, I can't remember why I took Allison as a student. No, I'm very glad I did, you know.
Absolutely.
Bright girl. And
yes.
Before too long, I'm going to suggest her for Academy membership.
I would agree with that.
Probably next year, maybe even this year.
Yes, yes.
You know, Susan graduated 2 years before Allison, so I figured Susan needed to come. But I had very few. But, you know, I'm in touch with both of them. Dean Lamont, who was out at St. Mary's, we're going to have lunch in the next couple of weeks. You know Dean really well. Stuff like that.
Very well. Yes.
So, you know, a couple of others, but, you know, that was basically it. I have had a number of postdoctoral students, but, you know,
now, was Janet Harris a PhD student of yours?
No. Janet came to Berkeley to do her doctoral degree, and I think she came to do it in education.
Oh, okay.
And she taught part-time for the Department of Physical Education. Yeah, I know Janet really well. In fact, we had a nice visit when the Academy meetings were down in San Diego. Right. Very bright woman.
Very much so.
Very bright woman.
Roberta, we should probably close.
I'm sure that you've had enough of this.
No, I enjoyed it very, very much, and I could continue much longer. I can tell you that. But I very much appreciate it.
So why are you all doing all this?
You know, it's something that I think it might have been Scott Kretschmer's. I think it might have been Scott's idea to interview, you know, Academy members, you know, life stories and events in their lives, and just to, you know, to maintain some records of membership. And I'd like to, what I plan to do is to do, a number of them over the remaining part of the year. I'm probably going to talk with Mike Ellis, for example, because I'm curious about some things up at the University of Oregon and all of that, which we could probably talk for another hour just about that particular situation. But there's a number of other folks on my list that I'm going to spend some time with and interview, and the interviews are all up on the AAKPE website that people can listen to.
Be sure to take my expletives out.
Well, we'll do some editing before we go public. We'll do some editing.
Well, if ever the time comes along when I can help to try to get physical education back into the mainstream, please let me know.
I certainly will, Roberta. And when Brenda and I are out in California next time, maybe I'll give you a call and we can get together for lunch.
I'd love it. Please do.
All right. I'm very appreciative of Roberta, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Good to talk to you, Dave.
All right, Roberta. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.